like to start by thanking Your Excellencies, Minister, esteemed colleagues. It's a real honor to be here. I'm going to start by apologizing for my lack of German. I suffer from something that some of you will know called being English, and it means everyone speaks my language, and so I can learn none. But I will give it my best. I'm learning. I'm getting there. I'm a professor of ecosystem ecology at ETH Zurich. Oh, I've moved on too fast. Where we study global ecosystems and their role in governing the carbon cycle. We do this so that we can better understand climate change, but also to generate predictive insights so that we can hopefully aid efforts to manage ecosystems in the fight against climate change. This year was the launch of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and I'm honored to say that I'm a chair of the board of this movement, trying to empower people across the world to restore and sustainably manage ecosystems in the fight against climate change. And we recently launched a new online digital platform called Restore, built to facilitate this entire movement, to facilitate a biodiversity movement. And now I imagine some of you might be thinking, great, we've got an academic talking about ecology. They're going to focus entirely on the ecology, entirely miss the real challenge of the economic side. And while that might be true to some degree, because I am purely an ecologist, I must always remind of everyone of the fact that this is constantly a balance between the ecological knowledge and the economic and the social context. And it's only when we get that balance right, when nature becomes the economically sustainable option for people around the world, that we do get truly sustainable and large-scale restoration and conservation of nature. And I do believe that there's need for real detailed ecological insights to facilitate those efforts, not just to promote. Often biodiversity can come at the expense of immediate productivity and short-term economic gains, but true ecological integrity can be so vital for long-term sustainable economic returns from nature, the sustainable movement that we need. So I'm not a forest manager, and I'm not a forester, and that's why for today I'm going to be presenting my work and talking about how we got here, but I'm also going to be sort of leaving a lot of time available for an open discussion, because I'd love to hear from all of you about the challenges facing foresters and land managers in the region, and I'd love to be able to discuss how and where science might be able to contribute in these discussions. So I have just come back from COP, which was a whirlwind experience, to say the least. I was honored to be sitting there watching Barack Obama give his incredible speech, essentially highlighting the vital roles of both outrage and optimism. We need outrage at the systems that got us here, but we also need optimism to turn that outrage into truly tangible action. And it was that optimism that seemed to pervade the entirety of COP this time around. And I was very excited to meet lots of heads of state and leaders, global leaders. Everyone was talking about this optimism, and everyone was talking about the role of nature. And this is quite special. This was truly the COP of nature. Everyone was talking about the country's no deforestation commitments, commitments to restoring vast areas of land to capture carbon, yes, but also to promote ecological integrity and human well-beings across the planet. This is a really exciting development for us, and for all of us here, because this has not always been the case. Most of the COPs in the past have focused on the energy sector, the transport sector, technological advances that are absolutely vital for limiting carbon emissions and addressing climate change. But it's now abundantly clear, and everybody was there to recognize the fact that we simply cannot meet our 1.5 degree targets without nature. And even if we could build a cooler world at the expense of nature, it would form an unlivable planet anyway. We need nature to survive, and that was at the heart of this COP, and I think that was something that was really exciting. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about about our journey and how we got here to this place, and hopefully how we're sort of using those insights to move forward. Because ultimately, in these efforts to address climate change, we need two simple things. We need to limit emissions, and we need to draw down the existing carbon from the atmosphere, as we all know. And to do those things, we need immensely powerful systems. Mass systems, we need thousands of solutions. But the most powerful system we know of to date is the natural system. This is a beautiful NASA simulation showing the carbon cycle throughout the year. You can see high concentrations of carbon in the beginning parts of the year, indicated by red. But as we tick on into spring and then summer, we see these red concentrations starting to fade. And that's caused by one simple thing that we are all familiar with. It's the emergence of leaves on trees. This simple ecological process is one of many massive fluxes that balance one another out throughout the year, and it regulates our carbon cycle and climate. A few months later, that carbon will be released back into the atmosphere as those leaves decompose, and it will continue the constant cycle. Now, as we know, humans are breaking that cycle, but given the massive, massive scale of this system, managing it effectively is undoubtedly one of our brightest avenues in the fight against climate change. But the challenge for a long time has been that, unlike the physics and chemistry of our planet, we've had a very limited understanding of the quantitative understanding of the biology of our planet. The organisms are what drive the carbon cycle and the water cycle that regulate our climate. They are what separate us from the other objects in our solar system, and ultimately they are what drive global biogeochemistry. And until now, we've relied heavily on fantastic satellite observations. These things provide incredible global coverage about the vegetation dynamics across the world. They give us insights into how the ecosystems are functioning. But they can't see below the canopy surface. And that means they struggle to be truly quantitative about the structure of those ecosystems. We're starting to move in that direction, but satellites alone cannot get us to that truly quantitative insights without bottom-up information, without the data from the ground, from the experts who know their ecosystems. So in our lab, we've been developing a new type of approach. Instead, based on a bottom-up knowledge, based on the millions and millions of observations about the soil, the plants, the vegetation, the animals that exist across our planet, so we can generate a quantitative understanding of these ecosystems. We then pair them up with satellite data to generate an understanding of climate change, and also to generate localized insights that can hopefully help to guide land management decisions at the scale at which it matters. And so we've used this kind of approach to study all components of ecosystems. Some of our earliest work was on the fungal systems across our planet. We mapped the mycorrhizal fungi that, as we all know, are essential for the survival of over 90% of the world's plants. And we mapped the mycorrhizal networks, the wood wide web, at a global scale, showing just how interconnected our forests are and understanding how changes from between ectomycorrhizal fungi and our buscular mycorrhizal fungi can drive significant changes in carbon dynamics across ecosystems. We also use this approach to understand the vulnerability of soil carbon stocks across the globe, showing how warming conditions can enhance carbon losses from permafrost regions in the high latitude areas, contributing somewhere in the order of 12 to 17% of ongoing climate change. As those carbon emissions keep going, the warmer it gets, the more carbon comes out, and then the warmer it gets, driving a positive feedback loop. But some of our most prominent work using this approach has been on our forests. And we've used this, the Global Forest Biodiversity Initiative dataset, which is 1.2 million locations across the globe and ever growing, where people have been monitoring, standing on the ground, monitoring over 60 million trees across all forested regions on the planet. And these are places where people have stood on the ground, foresters, experts, inventory analyses, where people have been looking at the species that are there, the number of trees that are there, the size of those trees, and taking data about the soil and the microorganisms that are necessary for facilitating those plants. And so with all that information, we can generate an understanding of the structure of those ecosystems, that it can be so vital for understanding dynamics and carbon storage and everything else. And with that information, by pairing it with satellite information, using machine learning and artificial intelligence, we can interpolate these observations all across the globe to start to generate an understanding of the global distributions of forest structure. And the earliest work focused on patterns of tree density, simply the number of trees per hectare across our planet. And by doing that, we could see the global biogeography of tree density and how human influence is disturbing those natural patterns. And it revealed ultimately that our Earth is home to just over 3 trillion trees. That's about 7 or 8 times bigger than the previous estimate had been, based solely on satellite data. And it really started to give us an understanding of the scale of this system. Because those 3 trillion trees well, and the forests that support them, store somewhere in the order of 450 gigatons of carbon, which is a huge carbon pool, an essential one that needs to be managed appropriately. We also in that study found that we're losing about 10 billion trees per year, directly contributing to carbon emissions. Essentially, the removal of forest ecosystems and natural ecosystems contributes somewhere in the order of 30% of our contributions to climate change. So protecting those ecosystems is a tangible and direct contribution to limiting carbon emissions, which is so central to the targets at COP. But at this point, I think it's worth mentioning a little thing we call uncertainty. So when we talk about global models, ultimately, we have to understand the scale of the uncertainty that's taking place. Because the more, like every statistical analysis, the more data we have, the stronger our predictions get. That means that at the global scale, we can be very confident and robust. But the uncertainty increases as the scale of our predictions decreases. And that means that in some places, we vastly overestimate the number of trees, and in other places, we vastly underestimate the area of trees. The nature of the statistical models mean that we overestimate as often as we underestimate. But it still means that at the local scale, those predictions aren't necessarily right. And that's why we need feedback from experts on the ground to say, no, this was totally wrong. Update that prediction, and we can update those models. And this is the start of the process that we're trying to build. And we've had some quite entertaining versions of these mess-ups in our uncertainty. One was, we got some interesting messages from people saying that we'd predicted a lot of trees on the Faroe Islands, which are a tiny area of land which has not a single tree. You can see we certainly got that one quite wrong. And we also went the other way with the Vatican City, and they were furious that we predicted there are 0 trees in the Vatican City. Obviously, there's, I don't know how many it is, in the order of 20 or 30 trees in there that we totally missed. So at these local scales, we're missing things. And we need more data from experts around the globe to refine those estimates and constantly improve. But these models are strongly robust at the global scale, and that can give us a different level of insights. And those 3 trillion trees, we can model where they exist now using information about the soil, the topography, the geology, and the climate. But we can also, and human influence, I should say. But we can also tweak those models so that we don't just understand where trees exist now, but we can, by removing the influence of human activity, explore where trees would naturally exist across our planet. And obviously, as we all know, there's room for vastly more trees in a non-human world across our planet. Now, I'd highlight the scale bar on the side here, just to highlight that this isn't an area where the whole world is 100% forest. The 100% forests are very limited across our planet, but there's a huge swath of the world's surface, including many dryland regions that have 10, 20, 30% tree cover that are a significant contribution to the Earth's tree potential. But this tree potential obviously is in a biophysical potential in the absence of humans. Obviously, currently, there's a lot of that land is still forested, and a lot of it is used for agriculture and urban land. But when we remove all of those land use types, we're left with what we called in this study the degraded lands. And these are essentially places where our model predicted that trees might naturally exist under today's climate, but where they no longer exist because of previous human activity. And these exist outside of the urban and agricultural lands that are currently in use. And this revealed that outside of those areas, if we could protect those ecosystems in the long term, there's room for just over 1 trillion new trees, another third of what currently exists. And if we could protect those ecosystems in the long term, 40, 50 years, maybe to 100 years in different regions, we could capture and sequester up to 30% of the excess carbon that's sitting in the atmosphere as a result of human activity. And this announcement absolutely exploded. We had no idea what that was going to do to our world. It just turned our world upside down, because within months, the United Nations launched their Trillion Tree campaign, the World Economic Forum launched a similar Trillion Tree campaign, and the movements are still going. Jane Goodall, just a few months ago, launched her own Trillion Tree campaign. Now, if they all succeed, we're going to be in a lot of trouble because there's not enough room for all those trees. But the message is to protect and revitalize nature as a tangible contribution to climate change. So when governments and companies started pledging their commitment to the protection of Earth's forests and the restoration of Earth's forests, many were doing so with the idea of a truly ecologically integral restoration movement for the biodiversity and people who depend on it. But many others were seeing it as an opportunity to greenwash, to essentially plant a blanket of trees to offset our guilt, so that we'd no longer need to worry about the challenges of cutting emissions or protecting the ecosystems that we still have. And obviously, there was an explosion in the media about this immense challenge, this supposed debate. Are trees good for the world? Are they bad for the world? And as the media tends to do, this polarized the world. But ultimately, as we all know, forests are not just about planting trees. Restoration is not just planting vast monocultures of plants that could, as a way of offsetting our guilt. That idea alone is a huge threat to the climate change movement and to the biodiversity that we all depend on. Because a wealth of ecological knowledge over the last century shows us that ecosystems are comprised of thousands of species, not just one. When we plant individual rows of a single species, those systems are often highly vulnerable to things like drought or beetle infestations, or and they lack the sustainability that comes with a truly interconnected system. But more importantly than that, they come at the expense of the thousands of other species that are necessary to maintain a sustainable ecosystem. These vast blankets of planted trees can be so damaging to local biodiversity. And it also, at a global scale, doesn't make sense economically either. We used the data from that Global Forest Biodiversity Initiative to explore, across those 1.2 million locations, the relationship between tree diversity and carbon storage and biomass production in all the different regions across the globe. And it's true, in some places, monocultures or low numbers of species was useful for fast production rates, initial production. But in the long term, across those ecosystems, we found that in the vast majority of systems, there was a strongly positive relationship between the number of species and the productivity, at least for the early parts of that curve. Usually plateaus off after about 40 or 50 species in the tropics and about 5 or 6 species in the boreal. And that understanding relates back to the carbon storage potential, but also the biomass production. So we then ran a model to using those slopes, using those relationships to estimate what happened if we turned all of the world's forests into monocultures of the fastest growing species. And that simple extrapolation, given the relationship between biodiversity and productivity, suggested that we would lose a lot of timber if we did that. And that's for the simple reason that multi-species combinations interact with one another. They all have different strategies for accessing water and nutrients and light, and that means collectively they can make a much more efficient use of all of those resources. And that means they can grow more effectively as an entire community. Whereas a single species stand is competing with one another. Directly for the same resources, other resources are being wasted. They make much less efficient use of those resources, and so collectively they put on less biomass at the same time as being less resilient and all the things that I mentioned earlier. And we estimated that if we could convert all of the world's existing forests into monocultures of the same single species, the worth of the world's forests would fall from around $616 billion per year by almost a half if we kept the same number of trees, but it was a single blanket monoculture. Now that is a purely theoretical analysis, but it highlights the true value of diversity when we think about managing ecosystems. And of course, I'm speaking to a room full of land managers and forest owners who understand the necessity of ecological integrity, but also the trade-offs with harvesting and managing smaller numbers of species. And ultimately, this research suggests that we need to find that balance to make sure we can have ecologically integral systems that can still be economically supportive. So we cannot, when we talk about a trillion trees movement, we cannot just think of this as planting blankets of trees. This is certainly not what anybody at the heart of these movements should be focusing on. Because ultimately, we need two different approaches for restoring and protecting the world's trees. The first is conservation. We do need to conserve nature. It's been estimated that we need to preserve about 30% of the land surface in true natural systems, truly natural conditions, to be able to maintain the species and the biodiversity and the ecological integrity that is necessary for keeping all of us alive. And that includes protecting forests that currently exist, as you can see on the left of this picture, and protecting areas that are degraded, allowing them to recover. And that just simply means commitments of governments and organizations to no deforestation and protecting those ecosystems. But the rest of this movement, a large proportion of this movement, needs to come from successful ecosystem management. That, again, involves working with ecosystems that currently exist and with ecosystems that are to be restored so that they can become economically sustainable for local people. And that can take 1,000 different forms. In cities, it means cooling those cities and bringing reducing human health issues that are associated with high temperatures. That has direct economic consequences as well. In agricultural systems, it means mixed cropping and integration of agroforestry systems that can promote productivity at the same time as yields. So this picture is a picture from a field in Africa, but the same picture could be true of a holistic soil carbon farm in Canada, or a pine forest, or a forest in Northern Europe. Ultimately, managing ecosystems effectively is a central component of this global biodiversity movement, and that is essential if we're going to be moving towards a sustainable movement. And so that is why we've been working with all of our global data to build an online digital platform that I mentioned earlier called Restore. And soon we're going to be hearing from the CEO of Restore, Clara Rowe, to present just the functionalities that platform can provide to land managers and forest owners in this region. So Restore is built to facilitate a global restoration movement. And that doesn't just mean telling people which trees to plant, or telling people where to buy seeds, or telling people how to trade timber or carbon. It's essentially building an online, like a Google Maps for restoration, bringing together the entire marketplace to try to facilitate local initiatives across the planet. And so if you click this button saying Open Restore, you'll enter a sort of Google Maps type interface where you see thousands and thousands, around 70,000 projects across the globe, ranging across every different ecosystem type you can think of. And these are all places where people are managing those ecosystems for the sustainable economic development of the local communities. And I don't just want to talk to you about the whole global picture. I need to tell this through the individual stories. This is Destro. Destro is a coffee shop owner in Zurich, close to where I live. And he originally actually comes from Ethiopia. But Destro owns what I think is the best coffee shop in Zurich. You have to check it out. It's an online coffee shop, but they have a base in a company called Bula, where they sell their sustainable coffee. And Destro is one of the thousands and thousands of projects that you can find if you go and visit the Restore platform. If you zoom into Ethiopia, you'll start to see this. This is the area that Destro has drawn around his land with a very simple draw function. And the first thing you can see is just the mass extent of deforestation in the region. He's in an area of beautiful, dry, tropical forest, incredibly important for carbon and for biodiversity. And you can see that the region has been removed for coffee production over the last centuries. And that deforestation has been continuing to grow. But as you zoom into Destro's region, you see that it looks a bit different. They are not cutting down the forest to plant for their coffee plantations. Instead, they're actually preserving the forest. That forest is being protected and preserved, not just for the beauty of the biodiversity, but for the improved coffee production that they can find. So what they do is they plant their coffee, native coffee species, within the sunny patches within that tropical forest. And because the forest traps water and nutrients in the soil, those plants grow really well, better than they do outside, without the need for fertilizers or irrigation. And so the production is going really, really well. So on Restore, Destro can use this tool now for multiple reasons. First, on the side, you can see all of the kind of ecological information that he can get from our models. Remember, those models have uncertainty, but they can give him some of the first insights that can get him over some of those ecological challenges, like identifying which species to restore there. So he can see the full lists of all the different species that are able to live in that region, so that he can start to try to figure out which ones might be sustainable in the long term, and which one might be good for coffee production there. He can also get information about which species will be likely to live there 30 years in the future, so that he can imagine how to do climate-smart agroforestry. But Destro also gets information about the carbon storage and the carbon dynamics. You can see there's just over 40,000 tons of carbon in the soil within his region, and he can monitor the productivity each year and see the impacts of his decisions. Like, for example, in 2013, when they protected a patch of his land, allowing the ecosystems to recover, you can see that slight increase in productivity after those trees were cleared the years before. And so being able to monitor those impacts is really useful for Destro. But by far the most useful part is the connectivity. So Destro is now tangibly connected up to the entire environmental movement, the ever-growing environmental movement, so that he can find other projects to learn from and collaborate with, to understand how they've managed the invasive species that they've seen popping up in their region, and how they are connecting and sharing with funders, with the public, who can now support them with volunteering or with donations, and with customers who might want, well, investors who might want to invest. He can also upload data back to the system, which can improve his predictions and the predictions of all the others in his region. And ultimately, it allows him to connect with his customers, the customers in his shop. So now Destro has an iPad that he shows to everyone who buys his coffee, saying, if you'd like to buy a coffee, would you like to see the footprint of your coffee? And on that iPad, he can see this plot on Restore. And the customers can then say, wow, okay, well, what's the footprint of my coffee? And they can start to understand where their trees came from and understand the ecological impact of their purchases, which Destro was skeptical about at the beginning, but we found to be an incredible motivation for him, because his customers now feel engaged. They now have agency, so that they can start to make active decisions rather than going to the Starbucks down the road. They will choose Destro's coffee more frequently, so that they can understand not only is this beautiful tasting coffee, but they can understand that it's actually got a positive environmental footprint, not a negative one. And the impacts of this are being felt by the rest of Destro's community. It's not just his own farm. Now some of those other farmers around the area have heard about this, and they're starting to protect regions of land, allowing those forests, allowing those plants to regrow so that they can have more efficient and productive agriculture. And even the local school has started talking about doing the same thing, protecting a big patch of forest and setting up their own agroforestry within to have economic sustainability. This is one of the beautiful stories where nature truly does bring economic incentives to protect itself, to protect and promote biodiversity. And that means that nature is going to propagate, and it's going to grow, and it's going to bring more economic benefits. That means that nature will be promoted further. But this isn't a one-off example. There are examples of this in every different ecosystem, whether it's in Northern Europe, where intercropping and mixed species, it can increase agricultural yields, or in Kenya, where the planting of individual trees promotes the productivity of agricultural fields nearby. There are thousands of examples where effective solutions to find the economically sustainable option out of nature leads nature to propagate. But that's not always the case. And this brings me back to the example that I showed in the trailer at the beginning of the show. If you zoom into the Pedrogo Grande region of Portugal, you will find Sofia, who is the star of the show. And you'll learn about their struggles. And there's about, I think it's 7 or 8 different communities that are desperately trying to restore native species of cork and oak and strawberry trees that are existing in the region, so that they can protect themselves against those fires. This is one example of a project that is young, and it is early on. And that means they haven't yet found that economically sustainable option. At the moment, eucalyptus is still the option that gives them the most money, but they desperately, desperately want to change. And so Restore hopes to bring light to these stories as well, not only the success stories, but also the stories that are struggling, because it takes years and years and years, in some cases, to find the economically sustainable option from nature. And what governments and companies are starting to do now is commit to supporting these thousands of projects. But what I'm we've made mistakes in the past where people committed to vast monocultures of tree planting. The next generation of mistakes, I fear, is that people are only investing in the projects that are working. And they're only supporting the efforts that are already successful. And that means that WWF has 10 or 11 amazing, well-funded projects that are growing incredibly well, and everyone's giving their money to those 10 or 11 projects. But that is not a global restoration movement. A global restoration movement needs hundreds of thousands, hundreds of millions of local initiatives like this, moving towards success. So we would hope that investors and donors will see initiatives like this and support them in the 10, 20 years that they're going to need to move towards economically sustainable options. And ultimately, each one of these projects is an individual local initiative to promote the biodiversity and the local people who depend on it. But as the network of collective action grows, it is undoubtedly benefiting all of us. And this is the basis for a truly bottom-up global restoration movement. The pledges and commitments of governments are fantastic, and they must incentivize efforts around the world to support sustainable nature. But it's that bottom-up movement that's going to do it. And on Restore, everyone everywhere can engage in that process. The final thought that I've got for today is that the other side of COP was, alongside the optimism of the pledges, was the sort of outrage of the protesters outside. And that outrage is so vital for moving the dial in the right direction and pressuring people to make the right decisions. And that outrage was heard very clearly inside the COP buildings. And that's what President Obama was addressing in his speech. But ultimately, it can be so distressing and such a hopeless situation that climate change is so big and intangible and beyond all of us. But through nature, everyone everywhere can engage in that fight. And protecting and rewilding and bringing back economic sustainability from nature is something that we can all engage in to some degree. And in doing so, nature can be a thing that provides real agency to connect everyone towards a collective biodiversity movement. Thank you very much.